Hello, everybody, and welcome to our presentation about government policy and international trade with the closing case America and Kenya negotiate a trade deal. We are Tutorial 2 Group 1, and our group members are Sophia, Joshua, Sajin, Alicia, Anael, and Mika.
The first question was, should governments consider human rights when granting preferential trading rights to other countries? What are the arguments for and against this approach? So governments can always face difficult choice when deciding whether to link trade benefits to human rights standards. So I'll be giving some arguments in favor and against. So first of all, for the arguments in favor, so the first one would be ethical responsibility. Governments have a moral obligation to promote basic human rights like freedom from forced labor, child labor, and political repression. Granting trade advantages to countries that violate these rights can be seen as indirectly supporting abusive governments. From this perspective, it is morally right to ensure that economic benefits do not reward harmful behavior. Second of all would be using trade as leverage. So trade agreement can be powerful tools, and by making respect for human rights a condition for preferential trade access, governments can pressure other states to improve their practices. This approach gives human rights a formal place in global negotiations and encourages governments to consider social reforms alongside economic growth. Finally, public and consumer pressure. So consumers increasingly care about how and where products are made. Public protests, boycotts, and ethical consumption campaigns can push governments to act. Ignoring human rights concerns may lead to political backlash, forcing governments to respond to voter expectations. Now for the arguments against. So first of all would be economic self-interest. Restricting trade with certain countries can backfire economically. Governments may lose access to cheap raw materials, important supply chains, or fast-growing markets. And domestic workers and businesses may also suffer job losses as a result. Second of all, national sovereignty. Countries may see human rights-based trades conditioned as interference into internal affairs, and this can damage diplomatic relations and potentially lead to trade retaliation or complete breakdown of economic cooperation. Finally, limited effectiveness. Trade pressure does not always change government behavior. Political leaders often remain in power while ordinary citizens bear the cost through job losses, reduced incomes, or higher prices. And in some cases, the people most affected are those the policy aims to help. So overall, while human rights-based trade policies are ethically appealing, they also carry economic and political risks that a government must carefully weigh. The second question was, whose interest should be the primary concern of government trade policies? Is it producers or consumers? So in theory, trade policies should aim to maximize overall national welfare, but in practice, governments often face competing pressures, so I'll be giving a few arguments for that. So first of all, producer-focused policies in practice. Governments frequently design trade policies to protect domestic producers and their employees. Measures like tariff, subsidies, or import restriction shield local industry from foreign competition and help to preserve jobs. However, these policies in the end will often result in higher prices and fewer choices for the consumer. Second of all, as in for the impact on consumers, so consumers tend to bear the cost of protectionist policies. Reduced competition can lead to higher prices and lower quality and less innovation. Although these costs are spread across society and less visible, they can significantly reduce overall economic welfare. And finally, from an economic perspective, so economic theory generally supports prioritizing consumers. Free trade lowers prices and increases product variety and encourages efficiency and innovation. While some industries may struggle, the overall gains to society usually outweighs the losses. Long-term economic growth is stronger when resources are allocated based on comparative advantage rather than political protection. conclusion, we can say that consumer interest should be the primary focus of trade policy. Although governments often prioritize producers due to political pressure and job concerns, evidence suggests that consumer-oriented trade policies deliver broader and more sustainable benefits for society as a whole.
Hello, my name is Joshua and I will be presenting question 3. Given the arguments relating to the new trade theory and strategic trade policy, what kind of trade policy should business be pressuring governments to adopt? To begin with, governments can play an important role in helping domestic firms compete internationally by providing targeted subsidies, tax incentives, and R&D support. These measures can reduce costs, encouraging innovation, and allow firms to invest in new technologies that strengthen their position in global markets. Building on this, policy support should be directed towards industries that benefit from significant economies of scale. In these industries, early investment and first-mover advantages can lead to lower average costs and long-term dominance, making government support particularly effective. In addition, certain strategic industries such as high-tech manufacturing, which may require protection when international competition is intense and entry barriers are high. Supporting these sectors can help preserve national capabilities, technological leadership, and high-skilled employment. Finally, trade policy should focus on improving export competitiveness rather than relying on broad trade restrictions. By encouraging firms to succeed globally while avoiding widespread tariffs and quotas, governments can minimize market distortions and reduce the risk of retaliation from trading partners. Question 4, which can be summarized as: a US firm manufactures PCs in Thailand for export to the US. The US imposes a 100% tariff on Thai computer imports. How should the firm respond, and what does this reveal about the use of targeted trade barriers? In the first part of the question, I will answer how our firm should respond. First, the firm could lobby the US government to reconsider the tariffs by highlighting its negative impact on US firms, higher prices for consumers, and reduced competitiveness. If this is unsuccessful, the firm may absorb part of the additional costs or raise prices, although this risks losing market shares to competitors. At the same time, the firm could shift its focus toward non-US markets, increasing exports to regions not affected by the tariffs in order to maintain overall sales. Finally, the firm could relocate production to alternative locations such as Malaysia or Hong Kong, which were already considered in the original decision, allowing it to avoid the tariffs and reduce long-term political and trade risk. For the second part of the question, what does this tell you about the use of targeted trade barriers? To start with, targeted tariffs often end up harming domestic firms and consumers by raising costs and reducing competitiveness, rather than only affecting foreign producers. Moreover, these tariffs weaken the advantages of global supply chains, which depend on efficiency, specialization, and cross-border coordination. At the same time, such policies may fail to change the behavior of foreign governments, since firms can relocate production or adjust their operation to avoid the barriers. As a result, trade barriers increase uncertainty for multinational companies, making long-term planning and investment decisions more complex and risky.
Hello, my name is Mika Nagamori, and I will talk about question number 5, which is reread the management focus. Huawei export ban hits US firm. Is the US justified in banning US companies or foreign semiconductor makers that use American-made production technology from doing business with Huawei? What are the possible long-term implications of the policy? Who might benefit? Who might lose? What policy stance would you recommend the Biden administration adopt with regards to the export ban? So the first question was, can the US justify this action? So for the result, the US government primarily justifies it on the basis of national security concerns, arguing that Huawei equipment could potentially be used by the Chinese government for espionage. Huawei, however, denies these allegations and contends that ban is purely politically motivated. And now I will look up at long-term implications. The policy initiated a fragmentation of the global supply chain, leading to technological decoupling. The result is rising costs globally and the fundamental shift in the structure of a technological competition. So next I'm gonna talk about who might benefit and who might lose. So the primary losers include US companies like Google, which have lost billions of dollars in revenue and market share in China. Additionally, consumers are losers too, bearing the cost through high product prices and reduced choice. However, they are also beneficiaries. Competitors like Taiwan's MediaTek gains market share. More significantly, the ban accelerated the push of China's technological self-reliance, prompting massive R&D investment and innovations in domestic chip production. So the final question is, what policy stance should the Biden administration adopt? We recommend a balanced and multifaceted approach that seeks to balance security imperative with economic vitality. Firstly, global coordination. The US must work with allies to establish consistent international rules to address security concerns, which help maintain market stability and prevent regulatory loopholes. Secondly, minimize economic loss. We recommend exploring conditional licensing. This means permitting the controlled sales of non-sensitive technology, for example, older generation chips, to secure revenue for US firms. Furthermore, the ban itself should be used as a leverage in border geopolitical negotiation with China. And thirdly, investing domestically. To maintain global competitive advantage, the US must continuously strengthen domestic innovation, focusing investments on semiconductor manufacturing and next-generation technologies. In conclusion, the Huawei export ban is justifiable on national security grounds but has inflicted significant damage on US corporate revenue and inadvertently spread China's technological self-sufficiency. We recommend a policy centered on global coordination, conditional trade, and robust domestic innovation on negative this complex technological rivalry.
Hello, my name is Sophia Lindmeier, and I'm going to present the case summary of the case America and Kenya negotiate a trade deal. Strategic shift by the US. In the early 2020, the Trump administration changed its strategy, moving away from erecting trade barriers to formally negotiating a free trade deal with Kenya. Second, geopolitical motives. A primary goal was to counter China's growing influence in Africa with the belief that a successful deal with Kenya could also act as a model for other African nations. Third, China's presence and backlash. China has invested heavily in infrastructure, for example, a $4 billion railway, but this has led to African debt and resentment. fueled in part by racist comments from Chinese managers caught on video. Fourth, opportunity for the US. US Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer saw the rising anti China sentiment as a chance to step in and strengthen US Africa relations. Fifth, Kenya's economic strength. Kenya is East Africa's economic hub with a population of 53 million, a young, tech savvy workforce, and a strong GDP growth, approximately 4 to 6% pre 2020. Sixth, low trade volume. Total trade stands at just $1 billion a year, barely putting Kenya in the top of 100 of US trading partners, meaning the deal is unlikely to have a noticeable impact on the US economy. Seventh, Kenya's interest. Kenya welcomed the deal as the US was its third largest trading partner in 2019, importing 667 million US dollars worth of Kenyan goods like clothing, fruit, and coffee. Eighth, AGOA expiration. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, which grants duty-free access, expires in 2025, driving Kenya to seek a permanent agreement to secure trade flows. Ninth, power imbalance. Critics argue the deal may be unfair because the US economy is 200 times bigger than Kenya's, allowing American negotiators to dominate the terms. 10th, AFCFTA concerns. A bilateral US Kenya deal could run counter to the African Continental Free Trade Area, a multilateral agreement signed by 54 nations intended to create a unified African market.
Hello everyone, my name is Sajjan and I'm going to discuss question 1 of our case discussion. The question is split in 3. What is China's interest in investing heavily in infrastructure projects in countries such as Kenya? What is China trying to achieve with its Belt and Road Initiative? And should American policymakers be concerned about China's actions and intentions here? So, let's start. So, what is China's interest in investing heavily in infrastructure projects in countries such as Kenya? So, first of all, economic expansion. Obviously, due to these investments, China creates new markets for its goods and services, and Africa is very lucrative for that case because it has huge economic potential since it has huge population growth and is expected to be world's population center in a few years' time. Additionally, China of course wants to be at the hub of the global trading economy. For industrial expansion, these heavy investments into foreign countries of course support Chinese construction firms and support the Chinese labor market. For example, the railway project in Kenya connecting Nairobi with Mombasa had an investment volume of $4 billion US. On the map in the bottom you can see how huge this project is. Another factor is that is the long-term debt leverage. So African governments oftentimes are heavily in debt to China because of these investment projects. So many argue that China is following a debt trap diplomacy. And for the strategic and long-term objectives, many argue that China is doing a neo-colonialistic politics. Of course, China wants to secure trade routes and resource supply, for example, of rare earths. For the second part of the question, what is China trying to achieve with its Belt and Road Initiative? So the Belt and Road Initiative, short BRA, is China's global development strategy, which was launched in 2013. It focuses on funding major infrastructure projects in emerging countries, such as Kenya, enhancing trade and investment flows between Asia, Africa and Europe. A key project, for example, was the project which I already mentioned on the slide before, the $4 billion railway road connecting Mombasa and Nairobi. It's one of the largest infrastructure projects in Kenya since its independency. Objectives of this Belt and Road Initiative are promoting economic globalization, expanding China's global influence, and securing energy and resources for China. And for the last part of question 1, should American policymakers be concerned about China's action and intentions here? And the clear answer to that question is yes, they should. Why? Because China is a heavy economic competition, so they should, of course, try to outcompete their competition. And additionally, China is trying to reshape global standards. What does it mean? China's growing presence allows it to establish rules of commerce and governance in these countries they heavily invest in. And that causes oftentimes conflict with Western norms regarding transparency, environmental sustainability, labor rights, and of course, how I already mentioned, raising concerns about neo-colonialism. Additionally, it challenges the Western geopolitical dominance, so China's rising influence in Africa threatens to erode the long-standing leadership and soft power traditionally maintained by Western nations. That was question 1.
Hello, my name is Sophia Lindmeier and I'm going to present case discussion question number 2. In purely economic terms, who would benefit from a free trade deal between the United States and Kenya? Who might lose? Would you expect the net effect to be positive or negative? Who would benefit? US exporters such as firms in agriculture, pharmaceuticals, machinery, and services would gain improved access to the Kenyan market. US consumers would also benefit from lower prices and a greater variety of goods imported from Kenya, particularly agricultural products and textiles. US firms could also diversify supply chains and reduce production costs through sourcing and investment in Kenya. For Kenya, exporters, especially in textiles and agriculture, would benefit from improved or permanent access to the US market. Employment in export-oriented sectors in Kenya would likely increase, and also foreign direct investment from the United States could rise as trade barriers are reduced. Technology transfer and managerial know-how would support long-term economic development as well. Who might lose? US producers in industries that face increased competition from lower cost Kenyan imports, particularly textiles. Also, Kenyan firms that compete directly with highly productive US companies. And both governments may experience short term losses in tariff revenue. The net economic effect. Overall, the net economic effect is expected to be positive. Gains from trade efficiency improvements, lower consumer prices, and increased investment are likely to outweigh the localized and short term losses experienced by certain industries. Case discussion question number 3. Would a free trade deal have geopolitical implications for the United States? What about for Kenya? For the United States, a free trade agreement would strengthen US influence in East Africa, a strategically important region. It would serve as a counterbalance to China's growing presence in Africa, particularly through initiatives such as the Belt and the Road Initiative. The agreement would also deepen diplomatic and economic ties with Kenya, reinforcing US leadership and global trade. Also, it would signal renewed US engagement in bilateral trade agreements. Geopolitical implications for Kenya. Kenya will be able to diversify its international partnerships, reducing reliance on China. The country's geopolitical standing would improve by positioning Kenya as a key US partner in Africa, and it could strengthen its role as a regional economic and trade hub in East Africa. However, Kenya might face some challenges in balancing relationships with major global powers such as the United States and China. Overall, yes, a free trade agreement would have significant geopolitical implications for both countries. The United States would enhance its strategic influence in Africa, while Kenya would gain greater economic and diplomatic leverage, though at the cost of managing more complex geopolitical relationships.
In 2021, when the Biden administration replaced the Trump administration, many countries, including Kenya, wondered whether US trade policy will continue on the same path. Under President Trump, negotiations for a bilateral free trade agreement, FTA, with Kenya had begun. The question now is twofold. First, should the United States continue these negotiations, or should Kenya keep pushing for this deal as well? Let's examine the motivation and risk for both sides. So, first one, why the United States should consider continuing the free trade deal. First one, strengthening US influence in Africa. China has become a dominant economic presence in Africa, especially throughout the Belt and Road Initiative. By pursuing a trade deal with Kenya, the US could increase its strategic presence and offer an alternative to Chinese investments. It's not a trade issue, it's also geopolitical. Also supporting American business and exports. Kenya has the fastest growing economies in East Africa. A trade agreement will reduce tariffs and create better market access for the US companies in agriculture, technology, finance, and manufacturing. This could translate into new opportunities for American exporters and investors. And promoting higher standards, the Biden administration emphasizes labor rights, environmental protection, and democratic governance. A trade agreement could include strong standards and become a model for future partnerships with African countries. Secondly, why the United States might hesitate. First, domestic political priorities. Biden's agenda has focused heavily on rebuilding the US economy post-COVID and protecting American workers. New trade agreements can be politically sensitive, especially if they are perceived as threatening US jobs. And second one, shift toward multilateralism. The Biden administration tends to prefer working through global institutions or regional agreement rather than bilateral deals. This may reduce the urgency of a one-on-one agreement with Kenya. Third, why Kenya should continue to push for the deal. First one, economic growth and export opportunities. A trade agreement with the United States will give Kenya improved access to one of the world's largest consumer markets. Sectors such as textiles, agriculture, flowers, coffee, and manufactured goods could benefit significantly. Second one, attracting for US investments. A clear and stable trade framework would likely attract more American companies to Kenya, creating jobs and boosting infrastructure development. This would diversify Kenya's exporters, reducing dependence on China or Europe. Thirdly, positioning Kenya as a regional leader, so being the first sub-Saharan African country to have a bilateral trade agreement with the US will enhance Kenya's regional status and economic influence. So, then why Kenya must also be cautious? Very important. First one, domestic industries could be threatened. Opening the market to US products could harm smaller Kenyan producers who cannot compete with large US companies. Kenya must negotiate gradual liberalization and protect sensitive sectors, and maintaining policy independence. US trade agreements often come with strict conditions. Kenya must ensure that these requirements don't limit its sovereignty or its availability to regulate important sectors. So to conclude the question, we have one conclusion for the United States. The United States have to continuing negotiation, make strategic and economic sense. It supports US influence in Africa, opens new markets, and promotes American standards, however domestic political concern may slowly progress. And for Kenya, the benefits are potentially transformative, increased export, investment, and global visibility. Yet Kenya must negotiate carefully to protect vulnerable industry and preserve its policy autonomy. Overall, both countries have strong incentiveness to pursue a deal, but they must to do so thoughtfully, ensuring that the agreement is mutually beneficial and politically sustainable.
That was our presentation. Thank you to my team, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the forum. Thank you.